Hi guys, it's Lydia here, and I'm with my mom, Maggie. And we are here for our first episode of A Moment with Maggie, aka Mom. So we are a little bit novice at this, so don't judge our first episode, but I just want to give a little bit of the background of why we are doing this, or at least trying to do this. Growing up, Mom always had many, many stories, and uh, my brother and I would always enjoy her stories. And even now as an adult, I find that the stories that my mom told, I still remember, and the stories that she tells still really often will help me to connect head and heart. And I've heard it said one time that one of the ways to connect head and heart is through story. And so to me, that's what's on my heart for sharing or help letting her share her stories. And actually, my dad and I had to kind of twist her arm a little. She will tell you that she did not exactly want to do this, but she has listened to our just encouragement to do this for the reason just stated, that we want to bless others with some of the stories that have really blessed us and helped us to not just know about God in our head, but also experience Him in our heart. So that is the prayer going forward, that stories would help to connect head and heart. So to dive right into our first episode, the purpose of the first episode here is just to kind of get acquainted. So yeah, Mom, tell us about where you grew up or where you were born. Where are you from?
Well, I'm from Minnesota, and my mom and dad had 4 kids. I'm the third one, and they loved the Lord, and they taught us to love Him too. So that's kind of the beginning.
And what would you say are, if you had to pick maybe, I don't know, 1 or 2 or 3 important milestones in your life or things that have defined you, what would you want to share with us about yourself?
Well, as you know, I probably have 3 or 4 different milestones. Every time you talk to me, they'd be different. But I think walking with God is a milestone daily, so to speak. But the first thing I remember was that I was a sinner, and that the wages of sin is death, and I was going to hell. And I remember the night, and I knew God loved me. So I knew it was a fixable problem, and that Jesus had died for my sins. I'll never forget getting up off of my knees after I finished saying every word my mother said to me. And I don't have no clue what she said. I just know that I meant every word as I said it, which just enhances the power of God and what He does in a soul when they're convicted by sin. Because when I got up off my knees, I thought, I'm going to heaven, and I knew Jesus was mine, and I was so happy.
And you still remember that
vividly? Yes. It was a Davenport with flowers on it. We called it, instead of a couch, it was a Davenport. And and it was winter. Neat. Because I remember there were blankets hanging between the doors to keep the heat in the living room. And my mom and I were in the living room, and the other kids were shooed to the kitchen, and I saw them peeking. So yeah, I have vivid memories of that night.
So how did your life, like you were very young, you still remember it though, but do you remember your life changing after that?
I was 7, so I wasn't very young, but because I had wanted to receive Christ for a long time, but nobody asked me. And I think that's what later led me into the obvious ministry of leading children to Christ, because they're just sitting there waiting to be plucked. And when they're properly taught. And so what was your question?
Just if you did you see anything different in your life, or how did that impact your life?
Probably the thing that I remember so well was I knew I would belong to Jesus. I positively knew that. The impact, well, I think the way I see life was how God wired me. everything came through a spiritual lens. And some people even accused me of being super spiritual acting, but it really wasn't an act. I was far from perfect, but I knew, I mean, God just was very real, and every story was true, and I was strange that way.
So how, if you had to say maybe one of the most special attributes of God to you over the years, what would you say has been one of his most special attributes or ways of interacting with you, engaging with you?
Well, nobody asked me that question until I was in Bible college, and the word I chose then was good. And my friends during that era know that I think God is very good. And so, and I just, just God is so good. And I think it is because I know I deserved nothing being a rebel against God. And he's just been so good to me in every way. But then, over the years, you go through faithfulness, his faithfulness. So, of course, many different attributes. But that one was for a long, long time.
Neat. So you kind of alluded to it, and it was actually my next question. But what has been a way that God has burdened your heart, just in ministry or for a certain people group or some area?
Well, actually, that kind of answers another question, and that was after receiving Christ. I really wanted everybody to know about Jesus. I thought of them as saved or unsaved, which kind of, if I can just use you as an example, receiving Christ at 3, you were sitting there in your little chair in the back seat, looking out the windows there in Cebu, and you'd say, do those people know Jesus? Do those people know Jesus? And we'd say, well, Lydia, we don't know. And actually it was watching you receive Christ very young that helped me to remember that's what I had to. I remember the change that God put in my life.
I didn't even realize that all these years that was something that had triggered a memory of your own experience.
Well, what brought that on was I was teaching the maybe 5, 10, whatever things that you see in your life to so you know that you're saved. I mean, these transformations that you said, and so I had that list and I taught it dutifully. But then when you received Christ, I saw it.
Now, I happen to know your story about loving working with kids and even working with kids for many years with an organization, but how did that play into these two desires or these two interests that you've mentioned, loving kids and thinking of people in two groups, either saved or unsaved? So how did God use those two different areas together?
Well, back in those days, they always did missionary conferences every year at your church for a whole week, and then it was just big, wonderful time. Well, I remember some missionary from Africa, and he challenged us to be willing to go. Just say, God, I'll go. And so I did, and he asked us to come forward. I did not do that. That would have been much too embarrassing. But, and I love that too, because God just knows your heart, and he knows what you can do at any given point in time. And so that was I suppose the point, and that would be a huge takeaway, is you don't really have to do much. You just keep saying okay to God, and then he keeps doing much.
Yeah, that's cool. So for how many years was it you were working with kids then? I forget the number.
Was it 17, I think?
Okay, about 17-ish.
That would be 1 or 2 after I got married.
Okay, so then so that was the first okay, and then what was the second okay to changing your work? So first
of course, there were
Mm-hmm.
many okays along the way, because I didn't get married till I was 38, so I had to say okay to singleness. I mean, there's just everything in life you have to just say okay to, because there's just too many. That we are people, creatures who have great imaginations and desires for our life. So everything was an okay.
Yeah.
So the second thing I said okay to, what do
I
you want
guess
me to say?
that was when.
What are you thinking?
When you went to the mission field. How did you get that call to go to the mission field?
Oh, it was audible.
And I happen to know this story, but would you explain to our friends who are listening, how was that audible?
It went like this: Maggie, will you marry me? So Chuck was going, and I knew I loved him, and he was a good man, and definitely somebody I would like to spend the rest of my life with. And I had, I'd already not lived at home for a long time. So if you go with, the old song, I like those old hymns. Anywhere is Jesus, I can safely go. And here besides God, I had a wonderful man and 2 children. So,
so 2 great children out of...
Great.
Oh, well then the last, I guess, thing that you've, not the last, but the last most like current season of ministry even is different, and that's, what would you say currently is your...
You mean right now?
Right now, your current ministry.
Maybe this. Because this is something I've had more difficulty saying okay to. Are you
and yet we're still doing it.
We're still doing it.
Even though we forced you to do this.
Well, that's sometimes how it works.
It is. And I love too how God sometimes tells us clearly what to do, and sometimes tells others and helps us to help each other to find what's the right next thing. So, yes, as I've kind of mentioned already, my dad and I kind of have sort of forced you, convinced you, encouraged you to do this sharing of your life via podcast. So just having, as you've thought about it and prayed about it and then agreed to it, what would you say is a prayer or hope or something on your heart for those that are listening that you hope they can get from listening?
Well, maybe one, receive Christ if you don't know him. Lead people to Christ if they don't know him. Lead them to consecration where they say, God, I'll do anything, and then just help them to keep saying okay. And let's see, there was something else I thought of here.
Was it your life verse? You mentioned that before.
Yeah. Oh, right. So our last year of Bible college, we had to have our pictures taken for the book, and so they had us put our life verse, and I thought, oh, a life verse. Hadn't thought of that one before. But I came up, that's why I have my Bible open here, because it's in Hebrew, I guess it's not my Bible. It's here, and it's from Acts chapter 11, verse 23. Barnabas is talking, and he exhorted the new believers in Antioch that with purpose of heart they would cleave to the Lord. My mom had already died 2 years prior to my graduation, and I felt that I probably couldn't go on without her. I mean, I was young and left home, and then she died that next year.
And you were about, was it 19 when she died?
Yeah, 19. And I thought, I can't live without my mother. And of course, there's so many things we think we can't do. And so this verse, I happened to be reading in Acts, and I thought, this is a good verse, I like it. And it turned out that it really has become my life verse. Just cleave. All we have to do is hang on to God, because he does all the work. We just have to say, okay. And then another aspect would be for us to, my son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. So the first step is to just give God your heart. I mean, you received salvation. Now he says, now just give me your heart, because that's our inward being, our will and mind and emotions. Just give you, and then let your eyes observe my ways, because God has a way. And he wants us to be attentive to the way he works. And that, yes, mothers die. Yes, friends are taken away. Yes, there's disappointments of life. But yes, he is faithful. He's good. So I like those.
So in summary, what I heard you saying was what you hope for our viewers to get from this is, if for those listening that don't yet have a personal relationship with Christ, to say yes to him and his offer of salvation, and for those that do know him, to cleave to the Lord with purpose of heart, and to observe his ways and watch and listen and get to know his ways. And how are those three connected? Obviously the salvation one I can see would be the first step, but how would the other two be related? The observe God's ways and give him your heart and cleave to him. How are those three ideas, cleaving, observing, giving a heart, how are those related?
Maybe it's an attitude of dependence and need, because we are very capable people, actually, and we have very many good ideas, but God, and he gave all those to us, but our ways are not his. Like my mentor said to me once, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And I said, oh, I know what I want. I proceeded to tell her, and she looked at me, laughed, and said, yes, Maggie, that may be your desire today, but God knows the deepest desires, even the desires he himself wants to put there. And so it's not always what you're feeling or thinking at the moment. That's why he just wants us available to him.
Wonderful. And I have one more question. You had mentioned observing God's ways. How is that different from observing God and versus God's ways? What does that mean?
Well, in Psalm 103 it says that the people knew God's acts. They watched to see what God did. They knew he'd opened the sea. They knew he had fed them manna, which they didn't like in the wilderness, and he knew all this stuff. But then the verse goes on to say, but Moses knew God's ways. In other words, his reasons. And we learn that clearly through the Word of God. And it's from beginning to end. So at age 16, our church had read it through in 62, whatever age I was then. And so I began reading the Bible through, not every year, but almost every year since then. And it really affects our thinking, because we understand his ways, that yes, of course, we're going to be suffering and hurt and be disappointed because we are in a sinful, fallen world. But he is in us, so we can be excited and joyful in the sense of hope.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mom, for this first episode that we just completed. I'm sure the next one, hopefully, each one will both be more and more expert at. But it's been so good today to just hear a little bit about you and just some important things that have happened in your life, from your salvation to how God's led you to do different ministries, saying okay to him, and just your heart for our viewers to know God personally in saving faith, but also in going deeper with God and saying okay because you trust his way, his heart. So thank you, Mom. And to our viewers, we look forward to seeing you next time.